James had just arrived in the city that morning, feeling the rush of excitement and the pressure of a new chapter in his life. He'd been on the move for years, climbing the ladder in the business world, and today was supposed to be no different. It was just another day in his life, a day when he'd finally step foot into his newly purchased building for the first time. The sun was out, casting a golden glow over the bustling streets, and he felt the usual pulse of anticipation in his chest as he approached the address he'd only seen on paper before today. The building was located in the heart of the city, a towering structure that had once been a proud symbol of the area's elite. It was a gorgeous mix of modern and classic architecture, with large windows that reflected the surrounding skyscrapers. The kind of place that whispered power, wealth, and prestige. James had always had an eye for property, but it wasn't just about making money for him anymore, it was about creating something lasting, a space where people could feel valued, seen, and respected. He wanted to do things differently from the way it had been run before, and this was his chance. As James approached the entrance, he couldn't help but smile. He had worked so hard to get here, to finally own something substantial in a city that had both challenged and inspired him. He reached for his phone to text his wife, letting her know he'd made it safely. The door was just ahead, and as he stepped closer, he noticed a woman standing near the building's front desk through the large glass doors. She looked about middle-aged, dressed in a smart, but slightly outdated, uniform. She was staring at a clipboard with an air of authority. At first, James assumed she was just another employee, until she looked up and locked eyes with him. The woman's gaze was sharp, cold even, and she immediately looked him up and down. James hadn't expected it, but the look she gave him made him feel as though he were under scrutiny. He pushed the door open with a slight frown, shaking off the feeling, but she didn't budge. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a mixture of impatience and disdain. James blinked for a moment, a little taken aback by the directness. He smiled politely, stepping forward with the intention of introducing himself. "Yes, I'm James Lawson. I'm the new owner of the building. I just wanted to have a look around and start familiarizing myself with the property." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "The new owner, huh?" she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "That's interesting. You sure about that? Because I don't see anything in the system about any new ownership." James furrowed his brow, now beginning to feel a hint of irritation. "I've got the paperwork. You can verify it with the management office if you need confirmation." But she wasn't done. She shook her head, dismissing him with a quick glance. "I don't know, you don't exactly look like the type to be walking around with paperwork, do you?" She then looked him up and down again, her eyes scanning his attire, jeans, a simple t-shirt, and sneakers. Nothing particularly extravagant, just normal, casual wear. James could feel his patience waning. He had never been the type to let such comments slide, but he was determined not to let his first day on the job be marred by a petty confrontation. He simply smiled, attempting to keep his composure. "I assure you, I'm the new owner. There's no need to be rude." Her lips curled into a thin smile, one that wasn't friendly in the least. "Look, I'm sure you're just some guy off the street looking for an easy place to crash. People like you don't belong here. This is a prestigious building, not some rundown apartment you can just waltz into. I suggest you leave." James felt his jaw tighten. He had expected a few questions, but nothing like this. It was obvious that she was trying to assert some kind of control over him, treating him like an outsider, as if his mere presence was an affront to the building's standards. But something about her tone, her words, and the sheer arrogance she displayed was beginning to get to him. He had been the victim of people underestimating him his entire life. His success was always met with skepticism, often due to his background, his race, and the way he presented himself. He wasn't about to let this woman pull the same stunt. "Listen," James began, his voice steady but firm, "I'm not going anywhere. You can check the records, and you'll see I'm exactly who I say I am." "Karen," because that was the name on the badge she wore, seemed unimpressed. "Oh, I don't need to check anything. You've made it clear what kind of person you are," she sneered. "But, if you insist, I'll make a call and verify. But don't get any ideas. You're not going anywhere near the management office or the building without proper authorization." Her words were like a slap in the face, the kind of casual dismissal that James had encountered too many times before in his life. His hand clenched into a fist at his side. He'd had enough. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. The security guard, who had been quietly standing by the entrance, walked up to them. "Is everything all right here, Karen?" the guard asked, his voice low but curious. Karen, not missing a beat, turned to the guard and smirked. "This man is trying to gain access without permission. I don't know who he thinks he is, but he doesn't belong here." James was taken aback. He thought about his next move carefully. His mind raced, the pressure of the situation building. He had worked too hard to let this moment pass. But he couldn't just storm past Karen either. He was more than capable of making his point in a way that would leave her speechless, but he needed to ensure this wouldn't get out of hand. "Actually, I think you'll find that I do belong here," James said coolly, pulling out the ownership papers from his bag. "I'm the new owner of the building. The paperwork's in order. You can check with the previous management, or whoever you need to. But I'm not leaving." There was a long, tense silence. Karen's face reddened slightly, but she maintained her composure, staring at the documents as if she were trying to will them to disappear. The guard shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Neither of them moved for several moments, the tension hanging thick in the air. Finally, Karen scoffed. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're clearly just trying to pull something. This building's been in my hands for years. I know every corner of it, and I've never seen you around before." James held his ground. "Well, Karen, it looks like today's the day you get to meet the new owner. I'm here to make a few changes, but I think the first change should be your attitude." For a moment, Karen looked ready to argue, but something in James's calm demeanor seemed to shift the power dynamic in the room. She finally relented, though not without a harsh glare. "Fine," she muttered, "but don't think this is over. We'll see who gets the last word." As James stepped into the building, he could feel the weight of Karen's words on his back. The confrontation had only just begun, and he was starting to realize that his decision to buy the building would be far more complicated than he had ever imagined. What started as a simple visit was about to turn into something much bigger, something that would change the way this community saw him, and perhaps even how he saw himself. And the tension between him and Karen was just the beginning. James had always been the kind of person who believed in the power of hard work. He came from humble beginnings, raised in a small town where the odds were stacked against him. His family didn't have much, his parents worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and their sacrifices were the foundation of his drive. His father had always told him, "You have to work twice as hard to get half the respect." At the time, James hadn't fully understood the depth of that advice, but as he grew older, those words became the guiding principle of his life. He had gone to college on a scholarship, the first in his family to do so. He worked long hours as a server at a local restaurant, doing whatever it took to keep his grades up. His mother had always told him that education was the key to a better life, but it was hard to feel optimistic sometimes when you were surrounded by people who didn't believe in you, especially when you were black and trying to break into industries that had always been dominated by people who didn't look like you. The world didn't make it easy, but James was determined not to let that stop him. After graduation, he dove headfirst into the business world. It wasn't glamorous or easy, but it was what he had set his sights on. He worked for a small startup in the tech industry, learning the ropes from people who had already achieved the success he was striving for. He had an innate understanding of numbers and data, and soon, his potential was hard to ignore. By the time he was 30, James had made a name for himself as a successful entrepreneur, investing in properties and businesses, building a portfolio that made people take notice. But despite his accomplishments, there was still that nagging feeling that people still didn't take him seriously. When he had first heard about the apartment complex being up for sale, James knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. It was a large, high-rise building in a prime part of town, with a long history. On the surface, it seemed like just another acquisition, another step in his business journey. But for James, it was more than that. It was a chance to create something meaningful, to make a positive change in the community. The building had always been known for its exclusivity, its high-end tenants, and a strict set of unwritten rules about who belonged and who didn't. But James knew that the building had potential to become a space that welcomed everyone, regardless of their background or income. He had the resources, the vision, and the drive to transform it. After a lengthy negotiation process, James secured the property. He felt a sense of pride as he signed the final papers, knowing that this was the beginning of a new chapter. He had big plans, renovations, updates to the facilities, and most importantly, a more inclusive approach to the management of the building. He was ready to make an impact, to prove that his success wasn't just about making money but about giving back. He envisioned a place where people could come together, where they could feel comfortable and valued. But little did he know, this vision would be challenged from the moment he stepped into the building. James arrived on his first day with a mix of excitement and nerves. The sun was shining, the building looked pristine as he approached the entrance, and the weight of his decision settled over him. He was finally going to see it in person, to walk through the halls that would soon bear his name. As he stepped through the door, he was greeted by Karen, who, in hindsight, he should have recognized as the embodiment of everything he was about to challenge. Karen had been working at the building for over a decade, and in her mind, that gave her authority over every inch of the property. She was a fixture in the community, the one who kept everything running smoothly, or at least, that's what she told everyone. To the residents who had lived there for years, Karen was a known quantity, a no-nonsense manager who had little tolerance for anything she deemed out of place. She prided herself on maintaining the building's exclusivity, its standards. She had grown comfortable in her role, and the idea of someone new coming in, especially someone like James, who didn't fit the mold, was something she simply couldn't accept. James could tell from the moment they exchanged words that Karen wasn't going to make this easy. Her dismissive attitude, her judgmental glances, it all felt like an attempt to belittle him, to make him feel small. As she eyed him up and down, James knew exactly what she was thinking. He was another black man, casually dressed, who didn't belong in a building like this. The truth was, he'd experienced that kind of judgment before. People assumed that his success had come easily, that he wasn't worthy of the spaces he inhabited. But James wasn't here to prove anything to Karen. He was here to create something better, something that everyone could be proud of. But before he could even get a word in, she was already labeling him as a trespasser, questioning his right to be there. Her words cut through him, not because they were new, but because they were so painfully familiar. He had heard them before in different forms, from different people. You don't belong here. You're not good enough. You're just here to cause trouble. But this time, it wasn't going to work. He wasn't the same person who had walked through doors before, with his head down, trying to prove he belonged. James had earned his place in this world, and he wasn't going to let someone like Karen tell him otherwise. James didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath and calmly explained that he was the new owner of the building, that everything was in order. But Karen wouldn't hear it. Her disbelief turned to hostility as she demanded to see his credentials, dismissing him entirely with every word she spoke. James could feel the tension building, could feel the eyes of the other residents starting to shift in his direction. But he didn't back down. He remained firm, pulling out the official documents, his ownership papers, and calmly offering them to her. He knew that this was the moment, this was the test of his resolve. And then came the most unexpected twist of all. Karen's dismissive attitude didn't soften. Instead, it became more insistent. She accused him of lying, of trying to get something for nothing. James, taken aback by her unwavering certainty, realized that she wasn't just questioning his ownership, she was questioning his very right to exist in this space. It was a challenge, a direct attack on everything he stood for. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just trying to prove his ownership, he was fighting for something much bigger. This wasn't just about a property, it was about the message he was sending to Karen, to the residents, and to anyone who had ever been underestimated or marginalized. He wasn't going to let her win. What followed was a standoff, a moment suspended in time where James stood firm, his back straight, his eyes locked with Karen's, while the building itself seemed to hold its breath. Her gaze faltered just slightly, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of doubt. But it wasn't enough to stop her. Instead, she leaned into her role, clinging to the idea that her control over the building was absolute, and that no one, not even the owner, could threaten that control. And so, James, with the evidence in his hand and the calm of someone who knew they were right, stood his ground. He knew this was just the beginning. As he finally pushed past her and stepped into the building, James felt the weight of the challenge he was facing. He had underestimated how deeply entrenched the old guard was. But he wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about property management, it was about making a stand against the kind of exclusionary thinking that had defined places like this for far too long. And if Karen thought she could intimidate him, she was gravely mistaken. This battle was only beginning, and James was ready to fight. The days that followed James's confrontation with Karen at the building were some of the most tense and exhausting of his life. As he walked through the halls of the towering property, it was clear that his presence was unsettling to some of the residents. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others judgmental. The tension was palpable, but he wasn't about to let it stop him. He had a vision, and nothing, certainly not a few skeptical glances or passive-aggressive comments from a disgruntled building manager, was going to derail him from that goal. James began his transformation of the building with the areas he thought would make the most immediate impact: the lobby, the common spaces, and the management office. The goal was simple: he wanted to create an environment that felt welcoming to everyone, a place that was accessible, inclusive, and modern. He didn't want to alienate the existing residents, but he was determined to make it clear that things were changing. The old ways of maintaining exclusivity, of dividing people based on status or wealth, were over. But as he began to implement his changes, it became evident that Karen wasn't about to make things easy for him. Despite the paperwork, despite the legal ownership, Karen had made it her mission to undermine James at every turn. She dismissed the renovation plans with a wave of her hand, calling them unnecessary and expensive. She claimed that the residents would never go for the changes, insisting that the building had been fine the way it was. It was as if she was trying to protect her own little kingdom, refusing to acknowledge the new order of things. James's frustration grew with each passing day. He'd always prided himself on being level-headed, on being someone who could solve problems with logic and reason. But Karen's blatant disregard for his authority was something else entirely. She seemed determined to make his life as difficult as possible, actively working against the improvements he was trying to make. When James insisted that the residents be notified about the upcoming changes, Karen dragged her feet, ignoring his requests and even going so far as to withhold important information. It was becoming clear that Karen's refusal to accept his leadership was rooted in something deeper, something personal. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with contractors and a team of architects, James decided to pay another visit to the building. The project wasn't moving as quickly as he'd hoped, and Karen's interference was starting to slow everything down. He arrived after hours, hoping to have some quiet time to think through the next steps. As he entered the building's front doors, however, he immediately felt that familiar tension. The atmosphere was charged with something he couldn't quite place. He moved toward the elevator, intent on heading up to his office, when he heard voices coming from the lobby. James stopped in his tracks. It wasn't unusual to hear people chatting in the lobby, especially in the evenings, but these voices were different. They were harsh, raised in anger, and punctuated by a tone that sent a chill down his spine. He recognized one of the voices immediately. It was Karen's. But there was another voice, deeper and more commanding, that was almost unrecognizable. James moved closer, curiosity gnawing at him. "I'm telling you, it's a bad idea," Karen's voice rang out, her words sharp and filled with frustration. "This place is going to fall apart if he keeps making these changes. We can't let it happen. I can't let it happen. I've worked too hard to let some outsider come in and ruin everything." James's heart skipped a beat as he realized the conversation wasn't about him, it was about something much bigger. The deeper voice responded with a calm, but resolute, tone. "You're overreacting, Karen. He's the owner, and he's well within his rights. You need to accept it and work with him, not against him." James's pulse quickened. He stepped into the shadows of the hallway, his mind racing. The conversation was almost too quiet to hear, but the words that drifted to him were clear enough. Karen wasn't just fighting him because he was a newcomer, she was fighting him because of something deeper. There was a long history here, one that James was only beginning to unravel. He waited for a few more moments, hoping for some clue as to who the second voice belonged to. And then, as if on cue, the man's footsteps grew louder, and James instinctively stepped back into the darkness, out of sight. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and a purposeful stride. As he passed, James felt the faintest flicker of recognition. The man was one of the building's longtime tenants, someone who had lived in the building for years and had a reputation for being an influential figure in the community. James remained still, his mind working through the puzzle in front of him. He had known the building had its fair share of influential tenants, but he had no idea just how deeply connected they were to the building's management. It was becoming clear that Karen wasn't just holding on to power for the sake of the building's upkeep, she was holding on to it because it represented something much more personal to her. This was her kingdom, her domain, and James was the outsider. But what disturbed him most was the conversation's tone. Karen had been trying to push him out, to make him feel unwelcome, but now he realized she was actively conspiring with others in the building to undermine him. They weren't just concerned about the changes he was making, they were afraid of losing control. The realization hit James like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a battle over a building. It was a battle over who got to decide what was acceptable in the community. The next day, James decided it was time to confront Karen directly. He wasn't going to let the whispers and schemes continue behind his back. He needed to understand exactly what was going on, and why. When he walked into the building that afternoon, he could feel the weight of the challenge ahead. Karen was at her desk, scribbling something in a notebook, her posture rigid and defensive as usual. She didn't acknowledge him right away, but James wasn't going to wait for an invitation. "Karen, we need to talk," he said, his voice low but commanding. Karen looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "About what?" "I overheard your conversation last night," James said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You and that tenant, you're working against me, and I want to know why. Why are you trying so hard to stop the changes?" Karen's lips twitched, but she didn't speak right away. She knew she was caught, but instead of backing down, she leaned in, her tone defiant. "You don't understand what you're dealing with, James. This building is more than just bricks and mortar. It's a legacy. And you're threatening everything we've worked for." James felt his heart rate pick up. "Who is we, Karen? You're not the only one with a stake in this place. I'm the one who signed the papers, I'm the one who's investing in this community. So why don't you stop trying to sabotage the progress I'm trying to make and help me instead?" Karen shook her head slowly. "You think you're some big shot now because you've got money, but you don't get to come in here and change everything. You're not from this world. You don't belong here." James's eyes narrowed. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he didn't let it show. "I belong here just as much as anyone else. And I'm going to make sure this building reflects that. Whether you like it or not." As he walked away, he knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Karen wasn't going to make it easy, but he was done playing by her rules. It was time for him to take control of his building, and nothing, no matter how deep the resistance went, was going to stop him from making it his. As the days stretched on, James found himself entrenched in an invisible battle, one that was as much about power and control as it was about breaking down the barriers of prejudice and exclusion. He had initially thought that his journey as the new owner of the building would be one of progress and transformation, but instead, it had become a personal war against the entrenched systems of entitlement, the quiet racism that lurked beneath the surface, and the subtle manipulation of those who had benefited from decades of exclusivity. Every decision, every move he made, was met with resistance, not just from Karen, but from some of the tenants as well. What James hadn't expected was how personal this would get. What was at first a simple business venture had morphed into a matter of dignity and integrity. James couldn't quite shake the feeling that something bigger than just the renovations was at play. Karen, with her passive-aggressive behavior, wasn't just pushing back against the changes he was implementing because she disagreed with them. There was something deeper embedded in her resistance, something that felt like a defense of the old order, one where people like her were the gatekeepers, deciding who could belong and who could not. She wasn't simply fighting for the building, she was fighting for her perception of how the world should work, a world where a black man like James couldn't come in and turn things upside down. Every interaction felt loaded with a sense of historical injustice that he couldn't ignore. The tension escalated when James decided to call a meeting with all the building's residents. He had hoped that a collective discussion would help ease some of the discontent brewing within the building's walls. It was time to lay everything out in the open, his plans for the renovations, his vision for the future, and his desire to foster a community that was both inclusive and progressive. He needed to create transparency, to show everyone that he wasn't some corporate entity swooping in to take over. He was just a man who had worked hard for his success and was now trying to make a real difference. When the day of the meeting arrived, the atmosphere in the building was tense, to say the least. James had carefully prepared his speech, outlining his goals and the vision he had for the future. He was determined to present himself as someone who had the building's best interests at heart, someone who wanted to create a place where all the residents could feel proud to live. But as soon as he stepped into the large meeting room, he could feel the hostility in the air. The faces that turned to him were not welcoming, they were skeptical, almost accusatory. It wasn't just Karen's cold stare that met him at the front of the room, but several other residents who, like Karen, were resistant to change. Karen sat near the front, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pursed in disapproval. James knew that she was the one who had been quietly stirring up opposition against him, feeding doubts and fanning the flames of resistance. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had worked too hard to back down now. He cleared his throat and began. "Good evening, everyone. I want to start by saying that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight," James began, his voice steady but full of determination. "As most of you know, I am the new owner of this building. I want to assure you that my intention is not to disrupt or make changes that you don't agree with, but to improve things in a way that benefits everyone. I understand that change can be difficult, but I believe that this building can be something more than it has been. I believe it can be a place where people from all walks of life come together, where we foster a sense of community, where we respect one another, regardless of our backgrounds or financial status. That's my vision. And that's why I'm here." A murmur ran through the room, but James pushed forward, undeterred. "I know that there are some concerns about the renovations and the changes I'm proposing. I'm here to listen to your thoughts and answer any questions you have, but I also want to make it clear that this building, this community, is bigger than any one of us. We all have a stake in what happens next, and I believe we all deserve to have a voice in shaping that future. But this future will be one of inclusion, of equality, and of respect. And I won't back down from that. There was a pause, a silence that hung heavy in the air. James watched as the room processed his words, as some of the residents exchanged glances with one another. Some seemed to be taking in what he had said, others were clearly uncomfortable, but the unease was palpable. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she shot him a look that could only be described as cold disdain. "You really think you can come in here and just change everything?" One of the residents, an older man with a thick accent, spoke up. "You think this is just about fixing up a few walls and adding some new furniture? This is about the people who've lived here for years, who've made this place what it is. You can't just waltz in and tear down everything that's been built." James met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not here to tear anything down," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I am here to build something better. And that means creating an environment where everyone can feel comfortable, where people aren't excluded because of who they are or where they come from. If that's a problem for you, then we need to have a conversation about what kind of place we want this to be." The room fell silent again, the tension thickening. For a moment, James wondered if he had said too much, if the weight of his words had pushed things too far. But before anyone could speak up again, Karen stood from her seat. Her presence loomed over the room like a storm cloud. She was ready to fight, and it was clear that she wasn't going to back down. "James, let me make something very clear to you," Karen said, her voice biting with venom. "You think you can come in here and change the culture of this building just because you've got the money to do so. But this building isn't just a business venture for us. It's our home. It's where we've lived for years, and we've worked hard to create the community that exists here. You don't get to just come in and decide that everything should be different because you feel like it. You don't get to push people out just because they don't fit your idea of what this place should be." James's jaw clenched. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he refused to let it show. He had worked too hard, fought too long for his success, to let Karen, or anyone, dismiss his vision. He knew this was the fight he had been preparing for, and it wasn't going to be easy. But he wasn't backing down. "I'm not here to push anyone out," James said, his voice low but unwavering. "But I am here to make sure that everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are. You say this building is about community, but I don't see a community that's inclusive of everyone. I see a group of people who think they have the right to decide who belongs and who doesn't. I won't stand for that." Karen took a step forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can change everything, but you can't. This building is ours, not yours. You're just a businessman, and in the end, you'll see that you don't have the power you think you do." The word stung, but James stood his ground. "You're wrong, Karen," he said quietly, but with enough force that the room could hear him clearly. "I'm not just a businessman. I'm someone who believes that everyone deserves a chance, that we all deserve to be treated equally. And if that's something you can't accept, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." The room went dead silent. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had frozen, and in that silence, James knew he had made a stand. He wasn't just fighting for his property, he was fighting for his belief in a better, more inclusive world. This was more than just a renovation, it was a fight for equality, for respect, and for a future where no one was excluded because of their background, their skin color, or their wealth. James's words lingered in the air as the residents processed what had just been said. Some looked uncertain, others angry, but none of them could deny that James had made his position clear. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone, stop him from creating the community he believed in. As he left the meeting room that night, James felt a surge of both relief and anxiety. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he knew one thing for certain, he was ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just the new owner of the building, he was a man determined to change the world, one step at a time. And no one, not even Karen, could take that away from him. The weeks following the tense meeting were a whirlwind of escalating tensions and unexpected confrontations. James had expected some pushback. He knew that not everyone would embrace his vision right away. But what he hadn't anticipated was how entrenched the resistance would be. It wasn't just Karen anymore. As he navigated the halls of the building, he could feel the undercurrents of hostility. The whispers behind closed doors, the sidelong glances, and the passive-aggressive comments became more frequent. It was as if the entire building was divided into two factions, those who wanted change and those who wanted to keep things exactly as they had always been. James had expected some of the older tenants to be skeptical of his plans. Change was never easy, especially for those who had lived in the building for decades. But what he hadn't accounted for was how personal this had become. For some, it wasn't just about the building, it was about their own sense of control, their own position in the world. Karen wasn't just an obstacle, she was the embodiment of everything they feared about losing power. The more James pushed for progress, the more she dug her heels in, determined to protect her vision of what the building, and, by extension, the community, should be. One evening, as James was walking through the building's lower level, inspecting the progress on the renovations, he overheard a conversation that would change the course of the conflict. It was a hushed exchange between two residents, a middle-aged couple who had lived in the building for years. Their voices were quiet, but not quiet enough to go unnoticed. James paused in his tracks, straining to hear the words. "I don't know how much longer we can stand by and watch this." The man's voice was filled with frustration. "Karen's right. He's not one of us. We can't let him turn everything upside down." The woman responded, her tone laced with uncertainty. "But we've lived here for so long. It's like the place is changing too quickly. I don't know if I'm ready for this." James's stomach tightened. He had known there were residents who weren't thrilled about the changes, but hearing these words felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about renovation anymore. This was about belonging, about identity, and about who got to decide what was right for the community. As the couple continued to speak, James's mind raced. He didn't know how to fix the deep-seated fears they were expressing. He had no intention of forcing anyone out. His goal had always been to create a space where everyone, regardless of their background or status, could thrive. But it was clear that this wasn't just a matter of physical changes to the building. The emotional and psychological barriers were much more difficult to break down. The following days were marked by a mixture of hope and frustration. James met with contractors, continued to supervise the renovations, and tried to engage with residents who were open to the changes. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense of division in the building. Karen seemed to be getting bolder in her resistance, and her influence over the other tenants was becoming more evident. It wasn't just about the building anymore, it was about the power she had held for so long, and she wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. One morning, as James was walking through the building's lobby, he noticed a few new flyers posted on the bulletin board. His heart sank as he read the headline, "Save Our Community, Resist the Corporate Takeover." The flyer was simple, but the message was clear. It was a call to action, rallying the tenants to join Karen in her fight against the changes he was making. The flyer contained a list of grievances, mostly exaggerated or outright false, and a plea for the residents to stand together against the perceived threat James represented. The realization hit him like a freight train. Karen wasn't just rallying the residents out of fear of change, she was turning the building's community into a battleground. She had tapped into something much deeper than just resistance to renovation. She had weaponized the idea of community itself, using it as a tool to fight back against him. The longer he let this go on, the more divided the building would become. The damage to his efforts, and to the building's future, could be irreversible. James knew he had to act quickly. he couldn't afford to let Karen and her supporters define the narrative any longer. He needed to take control of the conversation, to show the residents that the changes he was implementing weren't about destroying the building's history or its sense of community. They were about improving it, making it more inclusive, and making sure that no one felt left out. Determined to turn things around, James called another meeting with the residents. This time, however, he wasn't going to rely on his speech alone. He knew that words could only go so far. He needed to show them what he was trying to build. He invited contractors to present the proposed changes, highlighting the improvements that would directly benefit the residents, new amenities, upgraded common spaces, and improved safety features. But most importantly, he arranged for a few of the residents who had supported the changes to speak up and share their stories. The night of the meeting, James walked into the room with a renewed sense of purpose. As he surveyed the faces of the tenants in attendance, he could see that things had changed. Some were still skeptical, their arms crossed in defiance. Others were more open, their curiosity piqued. But there was no denying the tension in the air. Karen sat near the front, as always, her eyes fixed on him with a cold, calculating gaze. She wasn't going to make this easy. "Thank you all for coming tonight," James began, his voice firm but welcoming. "I know there's been a lot of uncertainty and fear surrounding the changes I've been making here. I want to address that head-on, because I believe in transparency. I believe in open dialogue. This building, this community, is as much yours as it is mine, and I want you all to understand that the changes I'm implementing are not about taking anything away from you. They're about making this place a better home for everyone." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, some were skeptical, others hopeful. He wasn't sure which camp Karen was in, but he knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix. This was going to take time, patience, and a lot of hard work. James gestured to the contractor, who stood at the front of the room and began to present the renovation plans. They showed blueprints of the new common spaces, updated security measures, and plans to add a community garden in the courtyard, a space where everyone could come together and connect. It wasn't just about the physical changes. It was about creating opportunities for residents to interact, to feel like they were part of something bigger than themselves. Then, one of the longtime residents, a woman named Gloria, stood up. She had been living in the building for over 30 years, and she had seen the ups and downs of the neighborhood. She had seen families move in, and she had seen them move out. She had witnessed the changes in the city and the building, and she wasn't sure what to think about James at first. But now, as she looked around the room, she could see that the changes he was proposing weren't just about money. They were about people. "I've lived here a long time," Gloria began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I've seen a lot of changes in this building. But I've also seen a lot of things that could have been better. I see the potential in what James is trying to do. I see a community that's been divided for far too long, and I think it's time we came together." James could feel the shift in the room. Gloria's words were powerful, not just because she had lived in the building for so long, but because they came from a place of genuine care for the community. She wasn't just defending him, she was defending the idea of progress, of unity. One by one, other residents spoke up, each sharing their own thoughts on the changes James was making. Some expressed concerns, but most voiced their support. It wasn't a perfect meeting, and the tension was still there, but it was clear that the seeds of change were starting to take root. Karen's grip on the building was beginning to loosen. As the meeting came to a close, James felt a sense of cautious optimism. He knew that this wasn't the end of the battle, there would be more obstacles, more resistance, and more challenges ahead. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like there was hope. The building wasn't just his project anymore, it was a community effort. And if they could come together, despite their differences, there was no telling what they could accomplish. But as he walked out of the room that night, his phone buzzed in his pocket. James pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. It read, "You think you've won, but this isn't over. You've made a powerful enemy." His heart sank. The fight was far from over, and James knew that the real test was just beginning. The weeks after the meeting felt like a tense truce rather than a true resolution. James had hoped that the community's unity would continue to grow, that the momentum from Gloria's speech and the residents' support would carry them through the challenges ahead. However, the sense of peace he had briefly felt after the meeting began to dissipate as the reality of his situation set in. The message on his phone was a clear warning that his battle wasn't over. Someone was watching him closely, and James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope, barely holding on to his position. The building had been his dream, his chance to make a real difference, but it was now entangled in a web of power struggles and personal vendettas that he hadn't anticipated. James knew that Karen wasn't one to back down easily, but the cryptic message sent a shiver down his spine. Who could be behind it? The tone was threatening, filled with a sense of quiet malice. Was it someone within the building? Someone with an even greater stake in preserving the old ways than Karen? James couldn't let his guard down, not now. If anything, he had to push harder to prove that his vision was the right one. Determined to move forward, James decided to expand his efforts beyond the walls of the building. He reached out to local community organizations, hoping to build alliances that would not only strengthen his position but also give the building a broader sense of purpose. His vision wasn't just about renovations, it was about revitalizing the entire neighborhood. He wanted to bring in more resources, new businesses, cultural events, educational opportunities, for everyone, not just the building's residents. He believed that by fostering a greater sense of interconnectedness, they could overcome the divisions that had existed for far too long. But as James attended meetings with local groups, he began to realize just how much resistance existed outside the building as well. There were local business owners who had long held monopolies in the neighborhood, and they saw James's plans as a threat. They feared that his changes would push them out, disrupt their established way of doing business. It wasn't just Karen's influence that he had to contend with now, it was the larger economic forces that wanted to maintain the status quo. One day, while James was meeting with a local small business owner to discuss potential partnerships, he was interrupted by a phone call. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it felt urgent. James answered, his curiosity piqued. "Hello?" he said, his voice cautious. The voice on the other end was low and deliberate. "You think you're making changes, don't you? You think you're going to be the hero in all this. But you're nothing more than a pawn in a game you don't understand." James's blood ran cold. He recognized the tone, the same type of intimidation that had been hanging over him ever since he took ownership of the building. "Who is this?" he asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "You'll find out soon enough," the voice replied cryptically before the line went dead. James stared at the phone in his hand, a cold sweat forming on his brow. It was becoming clear that someone, or something, was working against him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The forces at play were much bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't just up against a disgruntled group of tenants, he was up against a network of people whose interests were so deeply entrenched that they would stop at nothing to maintain control. The following days were marked by a heightened sense of paranoia. James's every move seemed to be watched, scrutinized. He couldn't help but wonder if he was being followed when he walked through the neighborhood, or if someone had been listening in on his meetings. Even simple tasks, like picking up a coffee in the morning, started to feel like part of a larger, invisible conflict. His every step seemed to be carefully calculated, his every word taken as an opportunity for someone to twist his intentions. To make matters worse, the building itself was becoming increasingly hostile. Karen's influence was undeniable, she had somehow managed to rally more tenants to her cause. The flyers that had appeared on the bulletin board continued to be posted, and more residents were attending her meetings. They were afraid of the changes James was bringing, not because they didn't see the potential, but because they felt threatened by the shift in power. They didn't trust James, and in their eyes, he represented an outsider, someone who didn't understand what had made the building what it was. To them, he was the enemy, and they were determined to fight back, no matter the cost. But Karen wasn't just fighting for the building. She was fighting for her position. She had spent years manipulating the community to maintain control, and now that control was slipping away from her fingers. James could see it in her eyes, the desperation, the fury. She was losing, and she knew it. But she wasn't going down without a fight. James had no intention of losing either. He had worked too hard, come too far to let this battle define his life. If he wanted to succeed, he would have to outsmart her, outlast her. And the only way to do that was to outmaneuver her at every turn. In the weeks that followed, James began to escalate his efforts. He used his influence to secure funding for the neighborhood's revitalization projects, pushing through plans for a community center, a new park, and a series of small business grants. The goal was to create tangible change in the neighborhood, not just in the building. He hoped that by involving the wider community, he could shift the narrative away from personal vendettas and towards collective progress. It wasn't easy. There were constant roadblocks, resistance from local politicians, interference from entrenched business owners, and the constant pressure from Karen and her followers. But James refused to back down. Every time Karen spread misinformation or rallied more people to her cause, James countered with facts, with evidence, and with tangible results that showed his vision wasn't just about power, it was about improving lives. As the tension continued to mount, one event occurred that would change everything. A small fire broke out in the building's main hallway late one evening. It was nothing major, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the community. Fortunately, the building's fire alarms worked, and there were no casualties. But the damage was significant. The fire caused structural damage to a portion of the building, and it immediately threw a wrench in the renovation plans. James was devastated, not only because of the physical destruction but because it felt like another attack on everything he had worked for. The fire was the final straw for Karen and her followers. They rallied around the incident, painting it as a sign of the building's decline under James's management. The rumors spread quickly. The fire was a direct result of his unfit leadership. Karen accused James of neglecting the building's maintenance, of being too focused on his renovations to care about the safety of the tenants. It was a direct attack on his reputation, and it was working. James knew that if he didn't act quickly, he would lose everything. The building, the community, the future he had fought for, it was all hanging in the balance. But rather than retreat, James decided to confront the situation head-on. He called a town hall meeting, inviting everyone to come and hear the truth. He didn't just want to clear his name, he wanted to show the community that he was committed to the building's safety and their well-being. The town hall was packed, the tension thick in the air as James took the stage. He addressed the crowd, his voice steady but filled with determination. I know that the recent fire has caused fear and uncertainty, but I want to make one thing absolutely clear: I am here to protect this building and everyone in it. I did not neglect the safety of this building. The fire was a tragic accident, but I am taking full responsibility for what happened. We will rebuild. We will fix everything that was damaged. And we will make sure that nothing like this happens again. As James spoke, Karen sat in the front row, her arms crossed tightly, her face expressionless. But James could feel her watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake, hoping he would slip up. He didn't give her that satisfaction. I also want to take this opportunity to talk about what's next, James continued. This building is not just bricks and mortar, it's a community. And we have the chance to make it stronger, safer, and more inclusive than ever before. Together, we can overcome the challenges we've faced. Together, we can rebuild, not just the building, but the trust and the unity that this place deserves. For the first time in weeks, James felt like he was making progress. There were still many who were skeptical, still many who clung to Karen's narrative. But there were also others who were beginning to see the truth. They saw that James wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who believed in the potential of the community, a man who wanted to make things right. And that was a message that couldn't be silenced. As the meeting concluded, James felt a surge of determination. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone, take away the future he had envisioned. The fight wasn't over, but he was more resolved than ever to see it through. The building had a long way to go, but James knew that with each step forward, he was carving out a new path for the community, one that would leave behind the divisions of the past and lead them into a brighter future.